Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another book review on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we have this big, huge book to take a look at. This is the newest book by Bruce Canfield, and it is U.S. Small Arms of World War II, all of them. This thing is 864 pages. It is pretty huge and pretty darn comprehensive. Now, what's interesting, almost exactly 25 years ago, Mr. Canfield wrote a very similar book encompassing all of the U.S. small arms that were used in World War II. This is vastly expanded. That first version was 300 pages. This one is just under 900 pages. So unfortunately, I don't have a copy of his first book to do a side-by-side comparison, but just the fact that virtually 600 pages have been added to it says a lot about how much more in-depth this is. Now, it's frankly, the reason that I didn't buy his first book is that it was an overview of all the small arms in World War II in U.S. service. And that's generally not the sort of thing that I'm looking for my own library, because trying to cover all of that content in 300 pages kind of just tells me it's going to be a relatively light book in general. There's not going to be a whole lot of detail, and I would rather have like a serious in-depth guide to the various guns. Well, this book goes quite a lot further, and this really kind of splits the line between a kind of an overall, high view history and a detailed, serious, hardcore collector's guide. It's not really either one. I will point out that this book, as huge as it is a follow-up to Mr. Canfield's previous book, which is virtually the exact same size, almost 900 pages, but only on the M1 Garand. So this is a serious collector's guide to the M1. The new book, is an overview of basically everything. Now, it's a really good overview. Reading through it, I honestly came away quite impressed. In particular, there is a lot of discussion, a lot of firsthand accounting of how various weapons were used, whether guys in the field actually liked them, differences between European theater and Pacific theater operations, and how the guns performed. This is chock full of firsthand original commentary about the specific weapons in question. It is also extremely comprehensive. So within here, we cover, you think U.S. World War II, you're going to think, what, M1 Garand, 1911, the 1919 Browning machine guns. Like, that's the basic stuff, right? The M1 carbine. Well, this goes way further. So it actually starts with a nearly 150-page chapter on edged weapons, which I think is something of particular interest to Mr. Canfield, but it's a really good overview of a sort that you don't generally get outside of a much more specialized book. So this covers bayonets, trench knives, bolos, machetes, all sorts of cool and interesting edged weapons that were used by the U.S. military during World War II. I suspect almost everyone out there is going to find something in that chapter alone that they were like, wow, I didn't realize the U.S. in World War II had something like that. In addition, all of the chapters actually start before World War II and generally end a bit after World War II. So there's a lot of good context to why was a particular gun in World War II. A really good example would be the section on the M1917 rifle. This was a rifle that was adopted as a standard U.S. arm in World War I, and in fact more of them were issued in World War I by a wide margin than 1903 Springfields. But then what was their role in World War II? Well, they did have a role in World War II. It was much more limited, but Canfield discusses that and goes into significant detail on experimental and unusual and even prototype versions of a lot of these guns where they're interesting and relevant. A good example would be cut-down 1917 rifles for the Chinese, which is actually a real thing. A very rare thing, but a real thing. He also talks about, in various chapters, the experimental weapons that were considered but not adopted. On the wide scale, this will apply to things like the Johnson rifle and light machine gun, which were adopted but not in large numbers, but then also to things like experimental versions of the M1 Garand. Experimental M1 Garand tanker, quote-unquote, carbines. The experimental box magazine fed M1s, adapted and almost purchased right at the end of the war. The Winchester automatic rifle, as compared to the Browning automatic rifle. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit away from myself here. The chapters, I'm just going to read these to make sure I don't miss any. Edged weapons, handguns, rifles, .30 caliber carbines, obviously a very important element of U.S. World War II armament, shotguns, submachine guns, automatic rifles, which is going to be basically the BAR and the Johnson, machine guns, and then we get into some of the stuff that you don't see addressed in very many books at all, namely anti-tank rifles, which is mostly experimental stuff, but the US did have an anti-tank rifle that was formally issued and used in World War II, which you may be thinking about that and going, wait, what? An anti-tank rifle? Well, you'll have to check out the book to see what it is. Bazookas, really important piece of World War II armament that doesn't get a lot of discussion most places. Recoilless rifles, which is even more so than bazookas. Grenades, which covers both hand grenades and rifle grenades, and there's quite a lot of detail, and there's a wide variety of handheld explosives, grenades that were used, but again, most books don't cover them. If they do cover them, they cover them only in the shallowest level of detail, and there's quite a lot more in Canfield's book. And then mortars and flamethrowers. So it really is legitimately all of the small arms that the US put into service in World War II. So between, it's still not like a totally technical collector's guide. There's not going to be extensive discussion of serial numbers and very specific markings. There is discussion of how many of various types of guns were made. And when it comes to some things like, for example, 1911s made by Singer, there is discussion of why there was just a small number and how many and when, but you're not going to find extensive serial number tables covering everything and covering every little modification of the gun. Instead, what you're getting is, I would call it not a high level, but like a medium level overview of everything that the US used. And it goes into, as I said, a lot of detail on variations and small arms that you wouldn't necessarily normally think of. Revolvers. M1917 revolvers, victory models, US use of 38-200 revolvers, 2-inch barreled victory models, a lot of small variations that are beyond the scope of a smaller book, but fit nicely into this gigantic tome. So, as of this filming, I do not see this available on Amazon. It has just been released by Mowbray, the publisher. So I will include a link in the description text below where you can pick it up from Mowbray. It is $96 plus shipping, and I think it's $5 or $6 shipping from them. So it is a somewhat expensive book, but I think absolutely worth the money for the tremendous amount of content that it contains. If you're interested in the US in World War II and their small arms at all, you will find something useful in here. And I myself will, in fact, find a lot useful in here, especially with those firsthand accounts of how things were used in combat. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.